when the AF started these sessions, they sort of offered it to the young trustees as something to take on, and we jumped at the chance because we felt there was a huge gap in and not really a place for there to be an open discussion and share knowledge. So the aim of these talks has always been to talk about the design of practice and not necessarily anything to do with creating architecture. However, we feel these really need to be addressed so that we can run sustainable practices, thriving practices that are social, diverse, but at the same time able to get paid and, more importantly, pay everyone an acceptable living wage. So this in turn would then allow great architecture to come out of that. So Part 4 has always been this place to talk about things that architects don't really like to talk about. Before I open up this discussion, I'd just like to mention that the AF has a new and incredible group of young trustees. We're working on a series of events, initiatives that we hope will bring a new set of voices and ideas to the AF calendar. So if you'd like to get involved or have ideas, please do get in touch. So the following talk took the idea of one of the more challenging issues that we've seen many people talk about when starting a practice, and that's the client and architect relationship. In reality, this could be extended to other relationships in general, because as an architect, you need to be the mediator who has all the skills that can develop a project in various different ways. And usually it is that person who has to sort of have these different relationships, which we're really interested to sort of talk about. So to help distill some of these ideas, we've got a super panel, which I'm really excited to hear from. Martin Evans was due to join us, but unfortunately has sent his apologies. Nevertheless, we have a really exciting group who are doing great work in each of their roles. I won't make too much of an introduction as they will do these, but I'd like to welcome Farshid Moussavi, architect and educator, who at the age of 30 won the competition for the Yokohama ferry terminal in Japan. Diana Ibáñez López, senior curator at Create London, doing really great work, art-focused initiatives, including the House for Artists with Apparata and Grayson Perry. And Phillippa Banister, founder of Streetspace, doing excellent community engaged work. And as her strapline describes, they work with people to reimagine their streets and spaces. So as a slightly different format to the usual one, we've asked each speaker to illustrate their introduction with 3 images that represent their key moments of how they arrived to where they are. After the introductions, we'll open up the questions and hopefully we'll get you all involved. In terms of the chat, we've disabled it at the moment, but if you want to send your questions to Ellis, he'll forward those on and hopefully we'll get the conversation going. So
I'm at the Architecture Foundation, handle. Yeah.
Farshid, do you want to start?
I have to say, I think.
Sorry. Farshid, you're muted. Sorry, that's better. Try now.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
But let me see if I can go to my first slide. No, that's my last slide. Okay, so this is me, 30 years old, at the Architectural Association. This is how the office started, and I thought you might like to know that Alejandro was my partner at the time, and I started to teach at the AA partly because we were curious about teaching, but also it was a way for us to start a practice in the absence of any commission whatsoever. We started at the AA with Alan Balfour, who is in this photograph, being the chair of the AA. Shortly after, he asked us to publish our work in the AA files, and we looked at each other and said, oh my God, what are we going to publish? Because we had done a few competitions, but in each competition, we tried to do the competition to win, and that we thought has to mean also incurring some level of compromise. So we said, okay, we are going to enter a string of competitions now, and just do what we want to do. It's about publishing it in the AA files as our manifesto, and not so much about winning it. But of course, the way we sort of practice was very much about building, and of course, reality was going to be part of it. So Yokohama was the second competition we did, and we won it, and it made the cover of AA files. So what is interesting about this is that we learned through the exercise that part of being a practice is also about doing what you want to do. And if you believe in it, then maybe other people will believe in it too. We carried on teaching and practicing at the same time. The right is images of, one of our units at the AA, and practice and teaching and going back and forth between the two is what I think defined FOA at the time. Part of this journey has been me becoming a mother and things becoming much more complicated. This is my daughter's drawing, demanding for a specific cake with all kinds of details on it, right in the middle of having to juggle between teaching and practice. Then, of course, the next phase of my career is when FOA disbanded, and I had to restart again at the height of the recession, the 2008 recession. It wasn't easy, and of course, it's never easy. And so, to some extent, I founded myself a startup again, except that I didn't have the overhead of a startup or the age. So what I've learned really over this time is that the only thing that is important is to remain agile, and maybe not to plan too much into the future, because the future is not controllable as much as perhaps sometimes we like it. So that's me.
Thank you, Farshid. Diana?
All right, so I've started with an image from my time at MVRDV. This is the last building I worked on after about 2 years there. And I picked it because it was one of the smallest, but also the only one which I saw from start to finish. And a very strange relationship in terms of architect-client, because the client was my boss.
Diana, I can't see your image. Can other people see it?
No, I can't see either, no.
I can see it. Let's have another go.
Sorry.
How's that?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is the Y Factory studio at the University of Delft. Winnie Mercer is the professor, and he was also the client and effectively the other half of the team. There were kind of 3 of us working on this to get the studio opened for the beginning of the autumn term after there had been a fire at Delft about 13 years ago. The scroll doesn't seem to be working. Help.
Have you got it on separate slides?
There we are. Yeah. I put this one there because the two together, because the TU Delft commission, it was a very small one, but it felt like extremely kind of jumping into architecture quite young and getting something finished and working very, very closely with an architect's desires as client. And then I moved to Cairo because I wanted a break from architecture and to have a couple of months of rethink about what I wanted to do. Ended up staying for a year, not having a client of my own at all, not really pitching things, and found myself partly teaching, getting involved with galleries, with designers, but in a really unspecific way. And I got incredibly interested in the photo on the right with the ambiguity that happened in the city around who builds things and why. This is a central police station in a 19th century colonial building, and then an extension which is semi-official, and then some kind of informal extension creeping above. And I started wondering more about kind of how the city grows, not so much the questions about the informal city or bottom up, but where this ambiguity happens between kind of state and the aesthetics of kind of state and politics in the city. a couple of years later, I was working as an editor at Phaidon Press on the 20th Century Atlas. And this same curiosity about kind of world migrations, migrations of style, influence, and the kind of the politics behind commissions, civic buildings, housing estates, kind of kept being the route I followed into how I wanted to understand more about architecture. I studied at the RCA in parallel, and then flipped into studying post-colonial literature and transnational studies and linguistics. And off from that, I started working with a startup in San Francisco that looked at the history behind the news, kind of political movements and recurring patterns. And at that point, I felt that I'd stepped too far from cities and from architecture and from form. And I really missed it. I'd just turned 30. I'd had this kind of slightly wild series of deviations and bumps, as you called them, Benny, when you wrote the brief for this. And I came back to London and completely flipped from working in the kind of fast startup word-based culture to asking that question again, kind of how does the city get commissioned? How do things officially get made? What shapes a lot of the ambiguous areas that we don't see, or we don't, as a student, certainly I didn't feel I really had sight of as a piece of architecture. So I went to work in a Greater London Council, working on everything from commissioning housing to thinking up new ways of engaging residents, to kind of cultural strategy work. And at that point, I started teaching at the University of Delft at the White Factory, and engaging again with these questions of a combination of a more architectural approach to answering questions, but also global visions about kind of urbanism in about 50 years' time, future cities. And the two together were a contrast that made me incredibly happy. I'd come back from having left the built form completely as part of my work to having these two polar opposites. And today I'm doing something quite similar, which is working at Create London as a curator, senior curator on the architecture, built environment, policy style projects. They're still art commissions, they're architecture commissions, but they tend to deal with either citywide issues or kind of a statewide issues. And then on the right, I'm teaching at the Royal College of Art in a unit that tackles a lot of kind of similar questions around politics, economics, and kind of social context behind architectural speculation. That's it.
Awesome.
My bumpy road.
Phillippa?
Can everyone see that? Yeah, cool. So I'm Phillippa, and I'm not an architect. So I just thought I'd share a little bit about a kind of the non-linear path that I've taken to today, and hopefully it's of interest. So I studied drama and English at university. I was really interested in kind of theatre for social change and how we use kind of theatre to animate spaces. And I spent a year in Cameroon in West Africa after studying, and just became really obsessed with how kind of markets and marketeers would sell products in public spaces. So kind of people sort of wanting to sell Maggie cubes would kind of go on lorries into the market and like shout and kind of have dance parties and like music, and it was just so animated. And I was like, you know, I was working for local government there, and I wanted to kind of replicate those ways of selling things, but for participation. So kind of getting people involved in having their say about where the new water pumps were or where new roads were being built. And so I worked with civil society and local government there to set up numerous programs with young local graduates to sort of, run public participation and sort of start that dialogue. And I just really found a place that I loved in between kind of state and community. So when then I moved to London and started working for a charity called Sustrands, mainly because I was interested in kind of community organising and kind of community power. And then I discovered kind of the power of streets because I was working as a community street design officer and was working on kind of long-term projects. So for example, 2 years working on the Becontree estate in Barking and Dagenham, where trying to kind of work together with people to prioritise streets and spaces that weren't safe, that weren't good for people, and how we could sort of re-establish and reclaim these spaces for community life. This is actually a school in Lambeth, but here we were working to try and sort of use really creative ways to slow traffic and to sort of try and make what happens when you make a space better for people, easier to cross, and how can community life thrive. And so I really just kind of got really obsessed with streets as being a stage for public life. And that I felt really joined up my sort of background in theatre. And so in 2018, I set up Streetspace in Barking and Dagenham. And we're working with people, as Benny said, to reimagine their streets and spaces to make them feel safer, bring joy and social connection. This is a project called Her Barking. And here we're looking at the perceptions of safety, which are much worse than actually the sort of levels of safety recorded in the town centre compared to other places with similar crime levels. So we worked with local women to prioritise different spaces and parts of streets and spaces in the town centre that didn't feel safe. And then together went on a collaborative design process where I asked people, you know, if you were having your best friend's birthday party in this alleyway, how would you redesign it? How would you transform it? And so we started off with these kind of very small scale, low cost prototypes on the left, solar lighting, tires, planting, and just got such great feedback from people. You know, these unloved spaces that have just been left and neglected that are actually sort of preventing women, especially, from accessing all the opportunities, social, educational, that the borough was offering. And this kind of escalated into an application for some national lottery funding, and then commissioned Hannah Benehud, who's also a trustee at the Young Architecture Foundation, to lead the co-design of the intervention on the right-hand side, which just went in February. And so, yeah, this is just one example of kind of the projects that we're trying to do to really reimagine and inspire people that these spaces can be for people and they can be shaped by people that live there.
Awesome, thanks so much. I mean, for me, the takeaway from all of these is that there's clearly something about how you talk to people, and especially Phillippa's just now. I think I'd like to go back to Farshid and to sort of hear a bit more about how young practices can do what they want to be doing in a way that, I mean, you're obviously very lucky with the competition, and I'm just reminded now of, it was all over Twitter about the competition in Tottenham, where a huge amount of people invested a lot of time in a very, very small commission. So I think in one sense, I want to understand if you have any advice about how you might approach those kinds of projects, because you know, essentially doing competition is for a client. You might not really know them, but I think that there's probably a lot that we could learn. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
In terms of just my thoughts on competitions generally, or the fact that
I think it would help to start think. Yeah.
I mean, I would say my practice before and now are the product of competitions, and I think through that, these competitions are a gamble, because you are not in front of the client and talking to them to fully understand what they want. And many of the times competitions are done also by clients to actually for them to come to an understanding of what they want. And they say one thing in their brief, but then they conclude that they wanted something else. And so you respond to their brief, they choose something else. So there is this aspect to competitions, but I would say the great advantage of competitions is that it sets the bar high in terms of architecture over everything else that the process of realizing a building is also about. Ideas are put at the forefront. And so if we want to create change through architecture, there are some where there could be through a participatory way, but my experience is that those become very small in scale. And for larger scale projects, we do rely on other people. We cannot just do it alone. And I think competitions are one way. Yes, Yokohama was in the paid competition. Many of the competitions we do are not paid competitions, but in the end, I think if I look back, I think we secure more interesting opportunities. So I find that they are worth it for our field. They are worth it for my practice, for people who work with me in my practice. I think in the end, they are worth it, as much as they have quite a lot of negatives also about them.
And I guess, Diana, I'm interested to hear from your side. You're, in a way, selecting architects through mini competitions, I presume. You've done a lot of commissions with very, very small young practices, and now they're doing incredible things. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you look for in small architectural practices and how they can position themselves, to get work and to speak better to clients.
It's quite a big question. Yes. Well, one thing I would say in response to the idea that briefs can sometimes ask for one thing and want another, I agree that happens a lot. I've experienced it from the other side, working in architecture, and then again working in a council, the sense that there are so many voices and so many questions asked even after the brief sent out, even after the briefs have come in and the projects have come in, that now create, as we work with local authorities or as we work with other partners, we spend quite a lot of time digging into the brief and translating, kind of doing some of this work around kind of what are we really asking, what do we really want to see that's helpful from, say, a young practice, and what's fair to ask within a kind of certain amount of money that's available for honorariums, which you can never live off, but kind of recognizing how much information can be offered in exchange for that. The other thing is quite a lot of invisible work around trying to ask the questions that have come from being in practice and seeing things not work. So where are the electricity and water points near this site if you really think that a budget of X amount can deliver all sorts of visions of interactive, kind of greener, livelier spaces. So I'm interested in a critical curatorial role where we can help shape those briefs so that anyone with an emerging practice could answer, and that the dream could actually match what the client would want. To answer your question, what are we looking for? I think there's no list, and I think that's absolutely right. I think what Farshid said of like knowing that you can follow what you think you would want to do. Often there's something more unlikely and more surprising and more inspiring in getting an honest response rather than a tailored response to a site. I think that would be one thing. Another is to ask critical questions of things like engagement. So kind of much like Phillippa did with the thinking through theatre and markets, kind of what to ask, who doesn't get asked. And sort of tailoring your approach to engagement, not to a kind of a broad net that catches as much as possible, but to a particular social or political or challenging question in the city, to a particular way of talking to people, and to know that not all projects can catch the whole kind of broad net of kind of, say, social challenges in a city. So zooming in.
I think we could open that question up to Phillippa as well, because obviously a lot of your work is about community engagement. So I guess from your point of view, you're in a way establishing your own clients, or certainly setting the brief. And it would be interesting to hear a bit more about the process that you go through for that.
Yeah, I think, we try and have a bit of a mixture, because I'm sort of got a non-profit part of the business, which is a CIC, which means that there's a freedom to kind of go for grant money, which is a really I think it's a really nice thing to be able to have to sort of balance. And I think if people are thinking about starting practices, it's really important to think about kind of whether you want to be able to get funding through grants, because obviously if you're you can be a non-profit company and still be eligible for kind of grant funding, which means that you can kind of develop grassroots projects with people from engagement and then kind of go out there to find the funding to sort of to then fit the project. And it means that because I'm very established in one location, that was a really kind of clear decision to sort of build a network of relationships that are very strong with not just community members, but also local authority officers. And so knowing who to sort of speak to about installing some lighting or, kind of connecting the dots, it's sort of much easier to be working in one kind of mini ecosystem, to be able to kind of know where the energy is and kind of build things up and then kind of call on relationships with people to sort of help make things happen. I think when we're working on projects, we work on a lot of projects that are funded from TfL or GLA funding, so sort of those like livable neighbourhood type projects and other kind of transport projects, which are actually, they're really understanding the value of really in-depth engagement in a place and realise like the sort of the value and outcomes that brings long term. And so we're luckily those briefs tend to be really holistic, so it's not just about sort of modes of transport shift, but it's also they recognise that it's about livable streets, about healthy streets, and so much comes under that about feeling safe or perceptions of things to see and do. And so those are the sorts of briefs that we're extremely fortunate to be kind of working on, which allow us to sort of tap into ideas that come out of those with working with people and then try and sort of look for funding to support, or also within the local authority, different departments are starting to understand how important it is to sort of build on ideas from residents and see how everything can then connect.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. We're going to open the questions soon, but I've got one that I'm really interested to hear you guys speak about is speaking to clients from an architectural perspective. Certainly I find sometimes talking about architecture with capital A is not you don't really get the kind of conversations or the answers that you really want. So we're, through our training, the closest thing that we have to speaking to clients or practicing for that is probably the crit. But again, that's normally set up to talk about projects in an architectural way. So I just wonder if you've got any advice about whether it's a community, whether it's a private client, how you sort of approach those conversations. Diana, do you want to chip in?
I was just thinking, as Phillippa was speaking, that it's really important to still be architects. So as you kind of broaden out and talk to more and more people, whether it's community or clients, not to forget that there's something that you love investing time in, and just think how to translate that. So for example, with a local community, not necessarily saying, okay, now this is engagement, what do you want? Let's do a big listen, although that can also be important. But perhaps you run a session about why good light matters and what that is. And then other conversations come out of that. Or perhaps you run a session around something that's enjoyable to make or do or share, whether that's a meal or a craft session. And then other conversations are possible because your skills as an architect are able to create an environment that isn't a Q&A. So that's one thought. And then translating that to the client, it's a slightly different nuance. But that same question as what you're communicating in a crit is in a slightly different language perhaps, but I think the content can still remain the same. Just add the question kind of why does light matter? Why is good design key? And rather than sort of drawing on these principles that you effectively work by, go a bit slower and say kind of what good design, which for me is A, B, and C here, can bring to this area or this project or this is this value. So kind of pulling apart that value chain and describing that. The other thing is, I'm very bad at this, but listening first. And then selecting the bit of your project that speaks to that question. Because there'll be kind of just questions around how this works or how this serves the kind of the bigger agenda, that brief that isn't always written down. And yeah, so I need to practice it, but listening first and then jumping in with how the project helps something shift.
Mm-hmm. Farshid, you've probably got some really interesting stories about working with clients. Can you share some?
Yeah, well, just really answering your questions about, because you said, well, you can't really talk about architecture. I think you must talk about architecture.
Mm-hmm.
If you not talk about, architecture is about so many things, of course, but if you don't talk about those things that are, let's say, important to you, architecturally speaking, as opposed to all the other members of the design team, let's not forget that the architects, to realize a building, work with a lot of different experts, work with people who are dealing with the structure and dealing with the services, dealing with artificial lighting, dealing with the climate, dealing with sustainability. If you start speaking about your work through their language, through their filters, I think you are dead as an architect. You are totally dead, because you will have no way to anchor things that you really want to deliver through the project, through your expertise in the end. There will be moments, every project goes, for example, through value engineering. Good projects, their ambitions are always greater than the means. And that's why you do have to go through that moment of value engineering. And things that stick are the ones that you've really argued for and you've articulated very clearly into the project. And if the architect is not going to speak about those things that are purely architectural, for example, the articulation of space, or the way, let's say, relationship between space and structure. The structural engineer is going to talk about structural engineering alone, services engineering is going to talk about only services, etc., etc. And the architect is the one who can speak about across them. And those are the architectural issues. The architecture of a building is how you bring these things together. And, their consequences, which are really important, may be light, it might be views, it might be how you feel in the space in terms of whether the space is light or heavy, directional, multi-directional, etc. You've got to articulate these things. And if you don't, your work won't end up where you want it to be, and your next work cannot profit from the good work that you could have delivered. So I think that that's our job. We have to learn to externalize what we feel strongly about, and those could be many things. I'm not trying to narrow them to space and light, but I think it's important that we put those agendas on the table.
I guess it's also might depend who the client is. If you're approaching a project and you're first speaking to a community, the conversation is obviously going to be very different. And even then, when the project is designed, I think talking to them about certain things, I think you need to be able to speak in similar terms. I don't know if maybe should we...
Can I just add something to that? I think clients that stick to you are the ones who are interested in what you say. And clients who don't stick to you are the ones who are not interested in what you say. And so you have to assume that the person who is talking to you and you're talking to them is interested in what you have to offer. and don't treat people anything less than what you think they should be. And I think people rise up actually, you know, to your challenge. And if I can bring you a very good example, that when we were doing Yokohama, the wood deck, especially on the roof, you know, it changes orientation constantly to adapt to the geometry, to the complex geometry of the roof kind of topography. And the easiest way to lay out the wood was to just put them kind of parallel, but it would not do what we wanted it to do, which was to work with the geometry of the kind of the form. And you know, we spent time with the kind of wood subcontractors explaining why we thought it was important, you know, and brought, for example, the kind of the analogy of fish scales, you know, of scales of a fish and how they relate to the shape of the, and you know, they were really excited that they were being brought on board into our way of thinking. And it was really complicated to lay that wood with that kind of setting out, but they did it. And because they felt part of the project. And I think part of the architect working with people, whether that's the client or the contractors, subcontractors, is to bring them on board to your project and make them feel part of the project. And I think that way you can do a lot, actually.
Mm.
I think that applies really directly to working with communities as well.
Mm. Well, I think we've got some really great questions, and one of them does kind of touch up on this. So can we get Hua Li to read out the question? You don't have to if you don't want to, but Ellis, will you be able to?
Endeavouring to unmute Hua Li. Yeah, he's unmuted now.
Hua Li, do you want to ask a question?
So my question was, can you hear me first?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how would you balance between the commitment to a community-related project and the job you have, the one that pays you? Because I was interested in helping a community-related project, like livable neighborhood, for example, but it requires a lot of energy and commitment, which I can't really spare while I'm working. And I'm not sure how to balance it. So that's my question.
I guess, Phillippa, that's maybe a question for you. I mean, for everyone, but if you want to answer first.
So, like, when I've been working on livable neighbourhood projects, they've actually been commissioned by the local authority who wants to understand kind of to make their bid better. So they commission Streetspace as a sort of intermediary facilitator to kind of understand what the issues are, develop aspirations, like really kind of work on the big picture of what people would like to reimagine their streets and spaces as. And then we kind of put that together and then take that to TfL and say, you know, will you fund this livable neighbourhood? So it's kind of, it depends very much on the local authority where you're working. Whether they're willing, and that's kind of from a past relationship that I have already cultivated from other work. So it's kind of like, yeah, if there's a local authority, then they really should be kind of looking at commissioning like community groups or community organisations or kind of skilled facilitators to understand what those needs are so that the bid can be better. I don't know if does that answer your question?
She's muted.
I'm struggling to.
Not. I wouldn't say it's. I don't know. Because I don't really like work in the like community related or like council related project. I'm working for like private projects separately, so I really need to make time after my main job, and it's really hard to like balance, even though I'm interested in these projects. But it's like, you know, like once you finish your main job, I'm really tired, and then I need to kind of work on to make this like the small ecosystem you mentioned as well. And it's like I have to like merge myself into architecture without having like private life at all to kind of do what I want to do, but then I still need to make money, because that's how the industry works, if that makes sense. And to be honest, I don't really know like the main question of this, because I think it's more private question. What would be the drive? What drives you to kind of to get to the point to work on both? Because this livable neighborhood project, it doesn't really bring me any like money, and then I'm kind of new. I'm just part to architecture assistant, so I need a job that can bring me money. I can't really have part-time on that side and then work on livable neighborhood project just because I like it. So that's my struggle, if that makes sense.
I mean, if I just, I know from experience myself that community-led projects are incredibly involved. And what I found is you're either sort of the enabler for the project to happen, and then you're essentially managing the project, or your delivery side, and you're then someone else has already got the project off the ground, and then you design it or help build it or whatever else. And I think that's a question for Diana, really, because I mean, you're essentially the person at Create that is trying to make these projects happen. So when you can sort of, maybe not so much on the work-life balance, but how projects get commissioned.
I think 101 ways. But I'd say that when looking at work with community, and there's also so many different ways of doing that, and especially looking at voluntary work, I'd say a couple of things. When we include volunteer work in a project, we're very careful around volunteer economies, not over-relying on free work, making sure roles and benefits to volunteers are clear. So is there training involved? Does it enable them to practice a particular skill, collaborate in a particular way? And what's the growth from that? You'd expect after 2 or 3 months for the benefit of that volunteering to have borne fruit, and then you shouldn't be working with that volunteer anymore. Where people do volunteer very regularly in a community group, it tends to be it tends to be in their neighborhood or in a really specific interest or topic, so they get a lot from it. And thinking back around the things I've done extracurricularly in my career, zigzagging around, they've ranged from organizing kind of live tango events to writing to helping people subtitling films, and they've often been things that for that couple of months were a question of mine somehow, kind of how do you do this, or how's this working? And then I'd say move on, make sure the volunteer work that you're doing, unless you've already committed in some way, is helping you build. I think even if you don't know exactly where it's going, it should be feeding your hunger for knowledge or your questions that somehow fit alongside your practice. The other thing I'd say is being clear about what you offer in your skills, because as Benni says, it is incredibly involved to work with people. It's working with people's lives, with what people have and what they don't very often, and being clear about what you as an architect can offer to a community, and for how long, and at which point. This is also there is some interest, and that not being a negative word at all, there's some interest in setting up, for example, a design project that you can get funding for, including what help you need from that community group to put that together, or from the council. Starting those from scratch without being part of an organization is possible, but quite hard.
We've got a question from Adam Jones. Can we get you to ask it, please? Alice, can you?
Adam's unmuted.
Hello.
Hi, Adam.
Hi there. Yeah, my question was, how does smaller emerging practice grow their scale of work and perhaps scale of client, particularly in the UK, which relies so heavily on a PQQ process, which therefore feels impossible to engage with larger projects without a hefty body of work behind you? I just wondered if there's any ideas, perhaps.
I think, Farshid, do you have any ideas? I mean, I think it was probably very different than it is now. But
well,
I mean,
no, in some ways not. I mean, I have two things to say about this. First of all, I think competitions, I think competitions are a way to obviously not these shortlisted, I would say anonymous, open competitions are a way to get out of all these PPQs that are in a way preconditioned, the kind of people and sizes that can secure the project in question. But I would say something else. I think over time, I have learned that a smaller project is no less interesting than a large project. And I would say, I started out from the largest project I have ever done at the beginning. And then later I did much smaller projects. And I don't think I had less, I was less vested in the smaller project than the larger project. And I don't think that the smaller project has less interest, but of course it's the questions are different at a smaller scale. So I would say one way to deal with this kind of question or dilemma is to just remove it and just work on interesting projects, no matter what scale they are at. And over time, hopefully the body of work that you have makes people realize that, if you've done a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that, that can be found in a larger project, well, you could do the larger project too, if you really want to do the larger project. But, larger projects are also a headache in another way. So it always, grass seems greener on the other side of the fence.
Do you find that to really be able to do that, to do work that you're interested in, do you have to have other income streams? Because,
you're talking to me?
Yes. Yes.
No. Where? What? No. In fact, I was going to kind of say in respect to the previous question that, I and the office does a lot of free work because we want to help in other ways. And I think to be an interesting practice, you should also forget about, putting profit as the main agenda of your practice. I mean, that's certainly not FMA. We need to remain solvent. Sometimes that's difficult. Some years it's been really tough just because, you're working on a project suddenly stops. We get the lockdown and things get on, put on hold. But generally speaking, obviously the aim is to remain solvent because we want to pay ourselves, pay our staff, etc. But I don't think that the practice is driven by profit making. And so because of that, when we can, we are doing things for organizations in different ways. That might not mean doing a community led project. Frankly, I would love to do it. We haven't done it. But it might be that we help, a kind of a gallery design an exhibition for free. That's also a way of helping your community, because many of these galleries and museums are non-profit organizations and they rely on the goodwill of people to, run their program, run their places. So I think that, this issue of work-life balance is also questionable. I look at all these other things that I do, the office does, as part of my life. So I don't look at them as taking life away from me. And therefore, yeah, there's so many hours in the day. I have to dig into my, what is, conventionally called private life in order to do other things. I don't know how else you would do it.
Diana, do you have anything to mention in terms of PQQs? Obviously, it's one of the bigger challenges of making the big jump. I mean, I've certainly no idea. I suffer the same as a small practice. I know that Southwark Council did a framework recently where they were trying to support emerging, small practice. It wasn't really emerging because the cap on turnover was 2 million, which is probably 95% of architects in the UK. But yeah, thoughts on sort of getting bigger work?
As an organisation, we're not on frameworks, and we often behave a lot like a young freelancer and do jump on all kinds of opportunities and give advice here and there and occasionally jump into things for free, and we shouldn't. But this same question of like, if there's a question there that really piques your interest as an individual, as an organisation, as a small practice, there probably shouldn't be that much of a distinction, as long as it makes sense for you as all three. Then get involved in those conversations. So some of the bigger work that we've got coming up, one of them isn't announced but includes invited competitions for fairly small bits of architecture, which is our scale, to be honest. So I don't have advice on getting big projects, but the series of commissions is a big project, and that comes out of, I think, a 9-year collaboration with the council that began with quite small things. So much like you would as a freelancer or as a young practice. And we've really deliberately stayed small. We've been between 7 and 11 people for the last decade, on and off, beginning maybe as 4 and then growing to that quite quickly, and have deliberately chosen not to grow, because whether it's right or wrong, we've got a sense that it helps us stay quite agile and hungry and kind of in these multiple conversations without getting bogged down in the running of, say, in our case, new arts organizations that we've been involved in commissioning and co-founding. So we kind of support those in becoming their own TIC, their own charity, get involved, collaborate with them. I think collaboration is another fantastic way of kind of work with a practice who knows more about consultation. And then when you've learnt that, or when your shared interests run out, kind of think about the conversations you're having very likely in your private life that inspire you. Because we know architects that inspire us, and we see them. And to kind of think about where those things are possible. But that doesn't answer your big job question. That answers the multiple small jobs and the slightly precarious, agile, end of year financial kind of counting the pennies approach. But I also, 2 more things, I guess. We find emerging practices interesting, partly because there tends to be that clarity of questioning and asking new questions and testing out ideas. I guess that's one. And then the other is that since we talked through the kind of bumpy career paths, in the zigzagging career paths, I've found it absolutely vital to how I see the world now. But it definitely, the paycheck does this. The more you choose where you want to go, and occasionally there's an up, but the more you choose where you want to go, it's at least heading in the direction towards kind of arts and commissioning and charity and community work. It isn't one that's necessarily going to cover your mortgage. But I wouldn't swap loving the job for more security ever.
I mean, that you touched on something interesting, which is having that connection with a council, and bit by bit, if you've got that relationship already, they might then start being able to offer you up for bigger projects. Because I mean, councils are commissioning huge projects all the time. And maybe Phillippa, can you kind of talk about your experience of working with them?
Diana, can I interrupt you and say that sometimes you offer them projects too, in the same way that individuals have ideas around what could change, students have amazing ideas about what could change. There are some incredibly powerful thesis projects out there. And once you're involved in these longer conversations, it's easier to have a more casual, what if we thought about this like this? So the building of that network is key to kind of allow those quite quiet moments where it's possible to pitch an idea for how something could change that's often been there for years. But it often takes years of thinking through it and kind of seeing an issue to then find the moment where it's right to pitch.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working in Barking Dagenham for 8 years, so kind of very much like, understanding a place and how it works and that kind of ecosystem of listening and relationships, and kind of then, being connected into kind of those conversations where there is actually loads of money and there's loads of problems, and it's just about kind of trying to kind of connect, ask questions, and sort of be in the places in between the different departments, because I think that's where try and see Streetspace, we're always in between. We're not really community development, we're not really street design and tactical urbanism, and we're not really fully collaborative design facilitation. We're kind of in the middle of all those bits, and that's where I think really interesting stuff happens, in the same way that we're working with highways, but we're also working with inclusive growth, we're also working with participation, and we're also working with the development agency. And so it's kind of in between all of those threads, there's like the sort of really like juicy kind of bits that then connected with neighborhoods and that knowledge and network with people and shopkeepers, and kind of that very like granular relationships, that it can all come together. And I think being committed to one place is a way that really like makes sense. I think on that sort of scale question, Streetspace, we're still really small, and we're probably going to be small forever, because I think small is really beautiful too. And I might look at sort of replicating in other places and other neighborhoods and other kind of similar geographies, but not kind of looking to sort of just do what we do in other places, but kind of a much more like intentional practice over a long term.
Brilliant. I think we're coming up to an hour, but let's just do one last question. Do we still have Shirin Azizi?
Well, why can't I find Shirin?
I mean, I can ask the question. It's quite a...
Benny, I think you might have to ask, so I'm not finding.
It's okay. So it says, I'd like to ask a question for Farshid, but I guess it's relevant to everyone. How can one individual coming from different backgrounds and cultures position herself in such highly ambitious architecture world in London with the latest sense of loss and overwhelming? I guess it's also, I think more generally, how do we all sort of think about what we are doing now in relation to what's going on? Farshid, do you want to start, as if it was directed to you?
Well, I think maybe there are several questions in a question. So one was about coming from another place. I mean, England has been my home since 1979. It's a long time, and it's more than 2/3 of my life, more than 3/4 of my life, maybe. So I feel I belong, and I feel it's my home, and I don't feel like I am from somewhere else. Yes, I was born somewhere else, and I have a mixed, let's say, I would say I have a mixed culture in me. But I think that part of the way people treat you is about also how you portray yourself, and how you treat, how you react towards your environment. So I haven't found that ever a kind of a problem. But I think if we translate that, maybe architecturally speaking is more interesting rather than biographically. I think the work that I do is perhaps not typical for the context, and that continues to be tough. We have done, for example, in the last few years, 2 housing projects in France, which are actually affordable housing projects, done, with a very kind of, with what affordable housing costs in France. And we haven't managed to, let's say, seduce any client. There's a housing shortage here. Housing has been commissioned recently, and our work doesn't seem to attract attention here in terms of housing developers. And so I think it's more about the misfit of perhaps the work you do, or the work you want to do, and perhaps what the marketplace thinks the work for housing should be. Now, either you change your work so that you get more work, or you carry on because you don't think that what the market is doing is right. Well, I have chosen the second. And therefore, we don't have housing at the moment in the UK. But, at the same time, given what's happening now, I think the market is going to be in crisis. So maybe they will listen more. Maybe they'll want to see other things. My lesson is like, you know, to stick your grounds, you know, keep carrying on doing what you believe in, because only then at least you look back and you're happy with whatever you managed to do in the end. And if you try to, you know, please the market and please the clients because they want that from you, they drop you every time there is a recession. You look at the work you've done and you become really disillusioned with yourself. So I would say, you know, I think it's an interesting question. I think when thought about architecturally speaking.
Diana, you're nodding as if you want to add something.
I was agreeing with that it was really important to be, but I heard it as being agile, but also being true to the thing that you think you're doing. And I think the two are possible together. So for example, with the COVID-19 crisis and the impact on, for example, being able to run public events, being able to co-design or talk to communities, or have sessions where you sort of listen before you design or before you commission, that's stopped. But equally it hasn't. And kind of being agile is asking the question, not what were we planning to do or what shape did we expect this project to have in a year, but what does it mean right now to be part of that network? Where can we be sometimes useful, but also what amount of communication can be helpful both for the project and to kind of make sure that network of solidarity or those conversations don't just stop abruptly because it doesn't fit the project. But another question is what happens in a year, kind of what's valuable, for example, around public realm commissions, what becomes even more valuable in the next year as there's more novelty or more clarity around use and need and kind of local use of public spaces, things we normally assume we might travel to and we won't. That sounds a bit vague, but there are about 7 projects at the moment where we're reconfiguring what it means to be in conversation with community, with architects and with artists, and often kind of changing the project round to make sure that the questions we're asking are still being asked, even if it means doing backflips in how we do them. I think architecture and design can do the same. I think critiquing the brief can do the same. You've all learned to do it at school. It remains an incredibly relevant part of working with any client, whether that's community or developer or council. Not as a criticism at a kind of break the original question angle, but as a criticism around reshaping, reforming, and constantly questioning what makes the work good, what makes the commission good, and what makes your architecture relevant to tomorrow and to the month after.
I think that's brilliant. Maybe we should sort of wrap up on that note. I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you so much for being so honest. And yeah, hopefully we'll do this again when we can actually see each other. All right.